the raft of the Medusa, based on a true story about a boat which ran aground, and these people find themselves on a raft. But we find that this painting by Jericho shows two triangles, hope and despair, and that we are the person in the middle who has to decide whether we will believe in the hope that is on the horizon, the salvation that is to come, or whether we'll be trapped in this world of death and despair. That even in secular works, we find that the truths of the gospel, the truths of our decision to believe or not to believe, are still present. Then we looked at this powerful work, The Wedding Feast at Cana by Veronese, where it looks like they're actually in Venice, not at all in Palestine. And we find at the table all sorts of people who have to choose to believe in the miracle of turning water into wine. But also we find ourselves at that table, choosing to believe in the miracle of Jesus Christ or to reject it, just like the people at that table would have chosen. Then we looked at the sacrifice of Isaac, this powerful story that we find in Genesis 22, powerfully painted by Rembrandt, who shows this moment where Abraham has been asked to put his all on the altar. And we see from that story and from this painting that we also are called to put everything on the altar, to offer our entire lives back to God. And that perhaps God might ask us to put things on the altar or to give up things that might not make us comfortable. Here, Abraham was saved. He didn't have to give up his son. But the challenge was that God asked him to be willing to give up everything. Because the reality is that God gave us everything that we are and have. Then last week, Christian Dybert, our ministry intern, spoke to you a bit about this powerful painting, The Calling of Matthew by Caravaggio, which you can go and see. I would encourage you to go and see it here in Rome, in the Church San Luigi dei Francesi, near Piazza Navona and the Pantheon, between the two. A powerful painting where Jesus interrupts his world, breaks into this world of money, and calls Matthew out of that. And Jesus is pointing to him, but you also notice that Matthew is kind of questioning this calling. Me? Are you talking to me? To show that each of us also have this moment in our life where Jesus calls us. And we have to answer. Jesus comes to seek us. And Jesus finds us there where we are, where we might even think we're hiding. But Jesus finds us and calls us. And we have the moment of standing up and responding like Matthew did. And that response impacts those who are around us, right? It seems to me in the painting, these two gentlemen are kind of waiting to see what's going to happen. These two are so engrossed in their money, they haven't even noticed that Jesus has entered. Interesting contrasts. Jesus calls us. Today we're going to look at another very iconic painting, right? Another one of the most famous works. If we were to list the 10 most famous works of art, it would certainly be one of those. So, I think I'm getting a cue. Children, if you'd like to go out for the children's class now, Rachel's going to take the children. So, we find this painting that some call a fresco, but which is not a fresco, and we'll talk about that as well. We find it in Milan. Have any of you actually seen it in person? Anyone made the trip up to see it? So, today I want us to examine this scene and to think a little bit about this setting, this story that we find in the Gospels. When I think of this scene at the table, I am taken back to a moment in my college years. I was a part of a large church in North Carolina, and each year they would put together an Easter drama that would portray the events of this Passion Week. And I was asked to play one of the disciples in this drama. Luckily not Judas, thank goodness. I think they asked someone else to play Judas. It's never quite an honor to be asked to play Judas, is it? But anyway, so I was among the disciples, and as we were practicing there, my very good friend, Knut, who was the best man in my wedding, was asked to play Jesus. And I remember us practicing this scene, and I remember him looking over at us all, because we were all very good friends, those of us who've been chosen to play these disciples. And I remember him saying, one of you is going to betray me. And for some reason, I heard it in a much more personal way than I had ever heard it before. I think to put it in the mouth of, these words in the mouth of one of my very best friends, it was very compelling and very touching. And I remember really wanting to react in that moment. Even though it was all acting and all drama, I wanted to react. I wanted to defend myself. I felt very accused. And I remember the woman who was directing the drama saying she just wanted us to look off sort of in the distance, sort of pensive and reflective. And I remember saying to her, but when he says that to me, it brings all sorts of emotions to me. I want to justify myself. I want to tell him that he's wrong. I want to argue with him. I want to deny it. And I think those are so many of the emotions that Leonardo da Vinci tries to capture in this representation. And so we're going to first read the scene, and then I want us to peel apart some of the details. So turn with me in Matthew chapter 26. Yes, Matthew 26, and let's begin reading in verse 17. So Matthew 26, beginning in verse 17 says, "On the first day of the feast of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, 'Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?' He replied, 'Go into the city to a certain man and tell him, the teacher says, my appointed time is near. I'm going to celebrate the Passover with my disciples at your house.' So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. When evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12. And while they were eating, he said, 'I tell you the truth, one of you will betray me.'" Now that's a powerful thing to say in the middle of a dinner party, isn't it? You gather your friends around the table for dinner, and while you're passing out the elements down the table, you say, "Oh, and by the way, one of you is going to stab me in the back." I challenge you to do it at your next dinner party, just to see what the reaction is of the people around the table. I have a feeling they won't be smiling at you, because it's a strange and powerful thing to say to a group of your friends, "One of you is going to betray me." And so we see their reaction in the next verse, in 22. They were very sad and began to say to him, one after the other, "Surely not I, Lord, surely not I." You can imagine them around the table. "Not me. It couldn't be me. Not me." And Jesus replied, "The one who has dipped his hand in the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him. But woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." Then Judas, the one who would betray him, said, "Surely not I, Rabbi." Now think about that. "Surely not I, not me." And Jesus answered, "Yes, it is you." While they were eating, Jesus took the bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body." Then he took the cup, gave thanks, and offered it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sin. I tell you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine from now on until the day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom." When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the mountain of Olives. Now it's interesting, this powerful scene at the table. Most artists would take this scene, and rather than doing what Da Vinci had done, they would choose to show the moment where Jesus is blessing the bread and passing the cup. Often in these reproductions, Judas would be off sulking in a corner somewhere, and the holy would be gathered there around him at the moment of sharing. But instead, Da Vinci has chosen in this moment to show their moment of surprise, the moment they're being accused, the moment where he says, "One of you is going to betray me." Now, the challenge with this work, as I said before, it is not a fresco. It is a method, a tempura, which means that he was experimenting with a new idea of mixing egg yolk with vinegar and oil paint and painting it on dry plaster. A fresco is painted in wet plaster, so that when the fresco dries, it is a part of it permanently, which also means you have a very short amount of time to do it and you can't correct anything. So Leonardo da Vinci was experimenting with this style. The problem was it was an experiment that went badly, because not long after, he spent about 4 years putting this work together, but not long after, it began to dry and fall off the wall. Pieces and chunks of it began to fall. Then there was a work to restore. Some people would argue maybe ruin or reproduce, because artists went into this work to try to recreate the parts which have fallen away. So what we see today is not entirely what Leonardo da Vinci himself created. But we're lucky enough to have major chunks of it left to show some powerful things that he tried to show us out of this story. So I want us to look a bit at who's here. He groups them in trios: Bartholomew, James, and Andrew. Notice Andrew with these hands forward saying, "Stop. Don't say any more. This can't be." Or a symbol of his own denial. Not me. Not me. Isn't it interesting when you accuse someone, how quickly our defense is to throw it onto someone else, right? Those of you who have children know this. When you say, "Who broke this?" immediately the fingers go like this, right? It's never this way. What we found interesting with Annalise when she was a child, because she's an only child, so it's difficult to blame it on the other siblings, right? She would even blame things on our dog, Napoleon. It was never Annalise, but often the dog who had done it. Maybe you've seen this, but even as adults, when you say to a room full of adults, someone has done something, immediately we begin to say, no, someone else, not me. And we see this in this powerful double-handed gesture of Andrew. Then, the most controversial of the trios, this one here, we have Judas, who's turned in a profile, almost in a dark face, in a shadow. We have Peter and John. If any of you have read any Dan Brown books, right? He maintains that this is not John, but Mary Magdalene, but I would say that it's John. Otherwise, John is missing from the painting, right? So we have this trio, and we'll talk in a moment about exactly what Judas is doing at the table, which is very powerful. Jesus in the middle, then Thomas, James, and Philip. Again, these broad-handed gestures of "it couldn't be me," "who are you talking to?" "Surely not me." And finally, Matthew, Thaddeus, and Simon the Zealot, all discussing with each other. And I love these hand gestures as well, because doesn't this look like we're giving the blame to someone else, right? Must be those guys. Can't you imagine them gathering? It couldn't be any of us. Must be one of those guys further down the table, right? Now, as we look at what Da Vinci's done, it's really powerful, because here, I'm going too far. When we look closely at what he's done with Judas, in one hand, Judas is holding a money bag, which we see here, and in the other, he's reaching for the bread, which is on the table. Now, the hand that is just here, which is at the same time reaching for this same bread, is the hand of Jesus Christ. Now, what's interesting is that means that he's put the money that he's already collected for betraying Jesus right on the table, right there in his hand. Because it's interesting, if you look at the passage, we see in the verses 14 through 16, which precede this section, Judas has already betrayed Jesus. He's already betrayed him, and yet he dares at the table to say, "Surely not I." And Da Vinci puts it forward even further that he's actually brought the money with him. He's just put it right down on the table, and still dares to say, "Surely not me," even with the proof of this betrayal in his hand. So on the one hand, he's holding this money, and the other hand, he's reaching out for the bread. What's also, I find, a very powerful symbol of how often we try to live in this world. With one hand on the physical things of this world, and with the other hand, we try to reach out with Christ, imagining that we can somehow hold both. And yet Jesus calls us to surrender the things of this world and our attachment to them when we reach out to Christ. The idea of surely not I, it couldn't be me. As we think about this, I think that we find ourselves in this same table with Judas. What's interesting is that many other productions or reproductions of this scene would put Judas on the other side of the table. This is a reproduction from the Sistine Chapel by Rossetti. And he does what most of the painters of this time would do, which is to put Judas on the opposite side, to say he really wasn't a part of the group. You also notice that they all have halos, and if you get very close, you have a demon on the shoulders of Judas pulling his halo away. He puts Judas on our side. But what I find interesting in this surely not I is that he puts Judas right there in the midst of all the other disciples. Why? Because I think that Da Vinci is saying, and I think the text is saying to us as well, that they were probably all just as broken and just as fallen as Judas. When we think forward in the story, we go to the moment where Jesus is arrested. And what happens? Pretty quickly they all scatter, don't they? And Jesus finds himself alone. And Peter, who has so valiantly said, I'll never deny you. And Jesus says, oh, you'll deny me all right. 3 times before sunrise tomorrow. Right? And so then we find that he does exactly what Jesus had predicted. And then when Jesus is hanging on the cross, we find at the foot of the cross, we find the ladies and John, the only disciple, there at the foot of the cross. So in many ways, they might not have taken a bag of coins for Jesus, but in their own way, they also betrayed Jesus. Now, when we think about that for us, what does our betrayal look like? I dare say that if I went around the room saying to each of you, have you betrayed Christ? We might easily say, well, no, what are you talking about? I've never denied Christ. I never did what Peter did. I never said, I don't even know Jesus. I've never taken money to turn over Jesus. I've never seen those things as more important. But I would dare argue that we're all as broken and as flawed as the people who were sitting at that first table. And again, you might say, well, how is that? Well, as we think about what true religion is, as we look at the book of James in the New Testament, who calls into question this idea that it's just faith, but it has to be faith lived out in our lives. And James makes this powerful statement to us about what true religion is, looking after orphans and widows, and keeping ourselves from being polluted by this world. What does that really mean? Well, looking out for orphans and widows. Why? Because they're the marginalized, the people without a voice. And we as Christians should be the first ones who are speaking out for those who don't have a voice. We should be the first ones in our society who are speaking out for refugees, for the oppressed. We should be the first who are speaking out to help and to save, because that's what true religion is. It's not enough to say, well, Jesus has changed my life and I'm good. Because Christianity is about community, and it's about the impact that it has beyond the walls of our churches. And sometimes we forget that. We think that religion is all about me and my own personal journey, and it starts there. But if our personal journey is meaningful, then it has to overflow onto those who are around us and in our community. And I would argue in the times when I have not done that, then I have betrayed Christ. In the times when I have not spoken out for those who needed to be spoken out for, when I have not spoken out for the defenseless, when I have not come to the aid of those who need me, then I have betrayed Christ. You might remember that Christ also tells the story, and he says to his disciples that what you've done unto the least of these, you've also done unto me. And keeping ourselves from being polluted by the world. It's interesting, again, Da Vinci puts that bag of money right there in his hand. But I wonder what it is that's in my hand that I've brought to the table with Jesus, that I somehow think is so important that I'm going to hold Christ's body in one hand and this worldly thing in the other. It might not be a bag of coins. Maybe it's something else. Influence, power, my health, what other people think of me. What would be the thing in my other hand that I think I'm holding on to at the table with Christ? As we think about all of this, what I find powerful in the story of the Last Supper is this reassurance that we find that Paul writes to the Romans, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Don't you find it interesting that Jesus says to them, one of you is going to betray me. He also knows that they're all going to betray him, but he doesn't refuse to serve them. In fact, he proves that he served Judas by saying, the one who has dipped with me, the one who has taken from my table. Isn't it interesting? If this were my dinner party, and I had realized that someone sitting at my table was going to stab me in the back and betray me, I'm not sure that I would start the service with them. I might invite them to find the front door. I might hold hard feelings against them at my table. And yet what's so powerful is that Jesus, even knowing their betrayal and their brokenness, invites them all to take his body and his blood. Even while we are still in our sin, God loves us. So many religions say to us that the purpose of religion is to help you become a good person, that you're going to work hard and become better and better. And what's interesting is the essence of Christianity that we find at this table says, in fact, the total opposite. That Christianity says to us all, you will never be good enough. And if the sentence ended there, that would sound terrible. Christianity says you will never be good enough, and so Jesus is going to do all the work for you. Jesus is going to die in your place, and you can accept that free gift and have your life changed. So it doesn't become about my list of the things that I'm doing to make myself good enough. Jesus knew that those at the table with him would never be good enough. And he broke his body and he gave his blood for them. While we were still sinners, Christ died for each of us. We each find ourselves just as broken and just as flawed as those who sat at the table. Today we're going to have some silence, and I want us to each think about where we are in our journey with Jesus Christ. We'll sing, and then eventually we are going to talk a bit more about the Lord's Supper by coming to his table and celebrating the Lord's Supper here together today. But I wanted to invite you into a time of reflection where we can confess to Jesus Christ to say, I'm sorry that I have betrayed you. Or we can say, I want to accept the gift of love and forgiveness that you offer me. Where are you in that journey? Because Christ invites us all to the table. Let's pray.